Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of Robinson Run. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Today I'm coming to you from the wonderfully historic and very special cemetery of Montours Presbyterian Church in Oakdale, Pennsylvania. This is one of the oldest cemeteries in Allegheny County, and it's really central to the story that we've been telling here on this channel so far over the past year. We're going to do a deep dive into the importance of the Presbyterian Church and, most importantly, the importance of the church to the settlers at Robinson Run. In a lot of ways, what you're seeing here is their greatest legacy that they left behind for us here in the 21st century. In fact, a lot of the earliest settlers that we've been talking about and studying are buried right here behind me. That's a story for another day, though. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about, before we do the deep dive into the history of the church and the sort of progression and development of religion on the frontier, is just have a conversation about the lay of the land, as it were, geography, as it were. Because as you can see behind me, we are on a very large, very high piece of ground. Presbyterian churches like this one really dot the landscape of western Pennsylvania and the Ohio River Valley. And they all have a few things in common. One of the most important things they have in common is that they always sit very high in terms of elevation. And Presbyterians always like to say that they do that because it gets them closer to God. And that's true. I'm not going to fight them on that. But there were also very practical reasons for building a church on a piece of high ground. And one of them was that part of the realities of the 18th century frontier was that British allied native warriors could attack and strike at any moment. And for a lot of these communities here by themselves, they only had themselves to rely on, and they had to pool their resources and their manpower to be successful if they want to survive. So high ground like this was really critical for these early settlers. It gave them a meeting place. It gave them a place to rally if things went pretty bad, pretty fast. Most native raids from native warriors were completely unexpected. Ambush tactics was very common at the time. So a piece of high ground like this was an essential, ideal place for community gatherings and meetings, no matter what the topic was. And when you're talking about creating a church, I think it's the perfect place. High ground like this gave you a vantage point for miles around. And we've heard already numerous stories about people seeking refuge at high ground, able to see for really as far as the eye can see whether the coast was clear or whether they were still in danger. So cemeteries like this are so important. But this church here, wonderful congregation, wonderful people, love history, proud of their history, is one of the great attachments we have to the Robinson Run community in the 18th century. And many of their descendants are still here. So let's head to the office, talk a bit about the emergence of this church. It's very revealing about life in the 18th century. And again, really sort of a critical moment of making it, of permanence, of staking their claim to this region for the people of Robinson Run. Hang tight. Here we are back in the office again. So now that we have a pretty good understanding of what the Montour Presbyterian Church looks like physically, we saw the ground itself, high, elevated. We saw what's there today. I want to use a little bit of office time here to talk about the history of Presbyterianism in this region, what was going on at the time, and what that looked like. Remember, we really hit hard, if you would. We really spent a lot of time with the idea that what really drove a lot of these early settlers, like James Ewing, like Gabriel and Isaac Walker, as we'll see in the coming episodes, like Joseph Scott, what really allowed them to risk it all and put themselves in such harm's way to move to this area was their deeply abiding Presbyterian faith. And, coming to the frontier wasn't easy. Bringing your faith with you wasn't easy either. Of course, everyone had an internal faith, an internal relationship with the Almighty. But to be Presbyterian was to be part of an organized religion. And much like other major organized religions, especially part of the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church or the Methodist Church, every church was part of a larger network or system of internal church governance. And out here on the frontier, that wasn't easy to come by, like anything was, though, right? Lead and seeds and knives and medicine and all of the things you need are kind of left behind in your old world. So for our Robinson Run community, finding a structured and organized Presbyterian presence here in the West was almost impossible. The fact was, if they wanted to have that luxury, they had to build it themselves. So you'll recall in episode 2, when we talked about the Reverend John Cuthbertson, and we traveled to Octorara Township in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, really where our Robinson Run community begins. We saw the efforts of a traveling minister named the Reverend John Cuthbertson, one of the most important Presbyterian ministers really in the history of North America. And the painting you see here is a Presbyterian minister doing his best to, again, tend to his flock under frontier circumstances. You'll notice these are not meetings that are held in churches in the 1770s and 1780s, but they're held outside. Sometimes they are held around a large oak tree. We know in the case of here in Robinson Run, the earliest Presbyterian ministries will be held using a pulpit that was literally made from a severed oak tree, and they fashioned the oak tree stump into a pulpit for the minister to preach. But they look a lot like this because, for these Presbyterians, their congregation, their community isn't a building, but it's the people themselves. So a meeting outside like this is something that would happen very prevalently and very commonly all across the American frontier in the 18th century, and certainly here in Robinson Run too. If you wanted a minister to come to your area, you would get one, but you'd pretty much have to wait because, as I said, like Cuthbertson, Presbyterian ministers were kind of traveling people that had to hit every community along the way. Remember, John Cuthbertson, upon his final years, speculated that he traveled upwards of 7,000 miles in his American journeys preaching to frontier communities. So let's take a look at Robinson Run, the development of their church community, and see where that comes from. Almost as soon as the Robinson Run settlers come to this area, of course, they're cutting down trees, they're building homes, they're establishing their homesteads. That's all very important. Almost immediately upon arriving here, they also begin to establish their foundation of faith. And one of the earliest people we see serving Robinson Run, or what they would say supplying Robinson Run, is the Presbyterian minister you see here, John McMillan. John McMillan had a pretty busy plate. He had a lot on his plate, that is to say, as a minister, because he would travel all across western Pennsylvania, and he was one of a few ministers that would do this, and he would pop into each community as he could, as best he could, to service them. Some of the things a person like McMillan would do when he came to a place like Robinson Run was he would preside over any maybe outstanding matters that needed a minister, like, for example, a funeral, or more likely a baptism or a marriage. Getting down on one knee and proposing was great for a lot of these Scots-Irish communities, and man, did they get married. And boy, did they have a lot of kids. Holy smokes. When you look at the genealogy of these people, there's always a baptism on the horizon. I would guess that a person like McMillan, a traveling minister, probably did nothing but baptize children every day of the week that he could as he traveled. But if you're one of these people in a place like Robinson Run or the surrounding communities, you have things you want to do, funerals, marriages, baptisms. You have to wait for a minister to come to you. So John McMillan, we have record of, is one of the earliest Presbyterian ministers in this area to come here and practice his faith. And again, for the Robinson Run community, the place where they would have seen him was on Chartiers Creek. Now, the area where McMillan had his sort of traveling Presbyterian ceremony is about a mile from the home of James Ewing. At this point, he's now Squire James Ewing. Again, at the far eastern edge of Robinson Run, right near that fort that we talked about in our previous episode, right, that came under attack in the summer of 1782. But that's what McMillan did. He kind of came and left and did what he could when he could. Now, you might be asking, what about the other, 364 days of the year? Are you just people without faith? Absolutely not. What Presbyterians, especially here on the frontier, really took to doing was finding elders, as they'd call them, or community leaders that were known to be pious or maybe even just politically well-connected to fill the void of this minister. So from the same records we talked about, the book we're going to be using for this is called Old Montour. It was written in 1923. It's a great collection of documents and primary sources dealing with the founding of the Montour Presbyterian Church. We know that Squire James Ewing was really filling that void. So remember way back in episode 3 or 4, we talked about in a deep dive who James Ewing was. By now, he's, again, a primary landowner. He's considered high-ranking in the Washington County militia, and he's a church leader as well. And that all goes hand in hand, because in the Scots-Irish community, to even be considered as a leader of a militia or a sheriff or a minister, you had to be already well respected. And a guy like James Ewing filled that void for when people like John McMillan, the traveling endorsed minister, were not available. Now, as early as 1778, we're going to see the Robinson Run communities around, again, the body of water itself, and the neighboring community, a group we haven't talked about yet, called Upper Raccoon. Upper Raccoon is today the city of McDonald, Pennsylvania. It's probably 4 miles or so, or less even, from Robinson Run. We saw those two joint communities, again, sort of operating in tandem. But as early as 1778, those two communities are going to begin to try to organize a church themselves. And that's a very difficult thing. And it's interrupted, of course, by the American Revolution and all the terrible realities of the Western frontier and warfare that we've talked about in previous episodes. But if you do visit the Montour Presbyterian Church today, the Montour Church will tell you that they were founded in 1778. And the reason we say that they're founded in 1778 is because that's when real earnest efforts began to organize. Remember, the building itself, the church itself, is not the church to the Scots-Irish Presbyterians. It's the community that's the church. So for them, in 1778, when they really begin to get the wheels in motion with men like James Ewing and Gabriel Walker and Isaac Walker, for them, that's when we're going to see, again, the church created, what we know today to be their church, the Montour Presbyterian Church. We're not talking about the completion of a building or a structure in 1778, but the community agrees that they need a permanent church, as we saw in the beginning of this episode, and we like to say 1778 is the beginning of that effort. But again, it was a central focus of life for the Scots-Irish. As important as building a farm, as important as having a militia, as important as having a family, is having a church. Now the question becomes, as the American Revolution continues, who will lead this church? Well, war is a terrible thing, we know that. But war also has a funny way of bringing out the best in people, showing, right, when the heat is on, who has what it takes to really make a go of being a true leader. And we see that here in the West in a lot of ways. And the man on the screen here, Joseph Patterson, is going to be in the center of that story. So who is Joseph Patterson? Well, Joseph Patterson in the 1780s is a young man. He's only in his 20s. But during one of the British Allied native raids that really terrorized the West, the British Allied Loyalist combined raids one of which we focused on in episode 7 that destroyed Robinson Run. During one of those raids at a place called Vance's Fort, Joseph Patterson's piety, his religiosity, his true character was revealed, and it made him the person that the community looked at as the ideal Presbyterian minister for their new fledgling, kind of still forming community here at Robinson Run. So let's take a look at what that story is. You see Joseph Patterson here on the screen as an older man. What exactly did he do to win the confidence of his people? So what we have here is a direct quote from Old Montour describing the sort of piety or the bravery of Joseph Patterson, as we saw. For some background information here, many of these small fortifications here in the West were under attack by British allied Indian warriors and their loyalist partners. One of them that came under attack, a community over, really a few communities over, from Robinson Run, was called Vance's Fort. Vance's Fort is today Burgettstown, Pennsylvania. So you're probably talking 10 to 15 miles away from Robinson Run. Here's our quote about Joseph Patterson. "There was but one pious man in the fort, Joseph Patterson, a layman and earnest and devoted Christian, whose zeal had not waned even amid the storm and terror of war. And during the long days and nights of their besiegement, he talked with his careless associates of an enemy more to be dreaded than the Indian, and a death more terrible than by the scalping knife. As they were shut up within the very narrow limits, his voice, though directed to one or two, could easily be heard by the whole company, and thus his personal exhortations became public addresses. Deep seriousness filled every breast, and some 20 persons were there led to Christ." So that is the story of Joseph Patterson, where he comes from, and why people cared about him as a leader so much. They said, essentially, if we're going to have a minister that comes from our community, this is going to be the guy. Because when the heat was on, when we were under attack, everyone was fighting for their lives, scrambling, panicking. There was one person talking about God, and it was Joseph Patterson. This will lead us to the very important moment of April 21st, 1789. Now remember, what's happened in the time between Joseph Patterson showing his resolve, coming under attack, and the moment we're about to talk about, April 21st, 1789. Well, the American Revolution ended. Robinson Run was attacked in 1782. Gabriel Walker had to bury 2 of his children in an unmarked grave, essentially, near a spring in what is today Rennerdale, Pennsylvania. Remember, if you want to see where those graves are, episode 8 is a whole episode about that, where they were. In Walker's mind, his children should have been buried in a true Presbyterian cemetery. But there was no Presbyterian church. Just like people met under trees, outdoors, you had to make do with what you had. But on April 21st, 1789, the joint communities of Upper Raccoon, this is named after Raccoon Creek, Upper Raccoon is today McDonald, Pennsylvania, and Robinson Run come together, and they petition the overall Greater Presbyterian Church for a minister, what they call a supply of a minister. That's a very uniquely Presbyterian term, a supply of a minister. And they write a very powerful document, very similar, by the way, to the document they wrote to the Congress via the Commandant of Fort Pitt in 1781. Remember, in 1781, they wrote a lengthy proclamation demanding protection and supplies, which they didn't get, and they all signed their names. That's how you got things done back then. And that's exactly what they're going to do here in April of 1789. So let's take a look. The letter reads, "To Mr. Joseph Patterson," and I'm going to edit this down a little bit. I'm going to read you the really important parts. "Preacher of the gospel. We, the subscribers, members of the United Congregations of Montour's Run and Upper Raccoon,
being on sufficient grounds well satisfied with your ministerial qualifications, and having good hopes from our past experiences of your labors, that your ministration in the gospel will be profitable to our spiritual interests, do earnestly call and desire you to undertake the pastoral office in said congregation, promising you, in the discharge of your duty, all proper support, encouragement, and obedience in the Lord. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And that you may be free from worldly cares and avocations, we hereby promise and oblige ourselves to pay you the sum of £120 in regular annual payments, which sum is to be paid in the way and manner specified in our subscription papers accompanying this call, which sum we oblige ourselves to pay annually during the time of your being and continuing the regular pastor of these united churches and congregations. So just to make it very clear what we're seeing here, the communities of Robinson Run, Montour Run, we'll talk about them a little later, and Upper Raccoon, that's McDonald, the next town over, are promising Joseph Patterson that if he comes to their little neck of the woods, literally, and serves as their minister, they saw him in action, they believe in him, their faith is in him, they'll not only support him, but they will pay him £120 per year out of their collective pockets. And they want to pay him enough that he is, quote, free from worldly cares and avocations, meaning you don't need another job. This is not going to be a part-time gig for you. This will be a full-time job. And they're making a very strong pitch to Joseph Patterson that he should choose their little community, their little neck of the woods, as the place he wants to practice and tend to his flock. And this is a big moment. It's a big moment for a few reasons. Number one, George Washington has been elected president in December of 1788. This is written April of 1789. The man has already put his hand on the Bible that spring, and he's our first president. So there is, an interesting little tie here of what's going on in the world. America's ready. America's ready to get started. We have a commander-in-chief. We've talked about it long enough. The uncertainty of the revolution is over. We're going to have a country. We're going to move forward. We do have a president. For the folks here at Robinson Run, it's time they had a church. And holy cow, look at this screen right now. I want you guys to see just how many people, all men of course, that signed their names on this petition. You can see it there, April 1789. Now, they're written alphabetically. These are not a very literate people. They didn't keep copious journals for the most part. Gabriel Walker, James Ewing, Isaac Walker. We don't have any of their writings. They're very busy trying to survive. But when it came to official documentation, they were very highly organized. And look at some of the names on here. Just off the top of my head, we can read through it. Names we'll all recognize. Names like Dunbar, Dunlap. We have names like Hunter, McCandless. That's obviously a very big name here in Western Pennsylvania. We have names like McGee, Potter, Rankin. Lots of Rankins there. But I've highlighted three specifically. Three people who signed this document that help us trace the larger narrative of our story, our micro-history here in Robinson Run. The first, you can see on the very top of the screen in yellow, none other than the man himself, the man who filled in for so many years as a temporary minister for these people, Squire James Ewing, the biggest landowner in the region, the man who controlled the fort, right? When things went south, they ran to him. Very politically powerful, enslaves several people, very rich, believed to be a community leader. He's on there as a signatory. We'll go a little further south. There we see in the middle highlight, Joseph Scott, Esquire. Means he's an attorney. He wants everyone to know it. We haven't really met Joseph Scott yet in this series. We've talked about him. But we're going to do a deep dive into who Joseph Scott is. He's as important as anyone else we talk about. But he's just going to be more important in the 1790s, while Gabriel and Isaac Walker were more important in the 1780s. And speak of the devil, we'll go down to the last highlighted person on the page. There we have Gabriel Walker himself signing his name. These are the most powerful people in Robinson Run. These are the most powerful people in this immediate area of Pittsburgh, essentially. And these are the people who are signing, promising annually to pay the salary of Joseph Patterson if he will arrive. Now, history is a lot of finding what is there. I understand that, but here's a little secret for everyone I want to let you key in on. Anyone can find what is there, okay? Seasoned historians have a different skill set that we develop over time. Our question becomes not what is there, but what's missing. What should be there that isn't. And there's a name on here that we aren't seeing. And it's one of the primary people we've been studying this whole series. Gabriel Walker is on there. His younger brother, 9 years younger, Isaac Walker, is not. So the question now becomes, what in the world is Isaac Walker doing? Why is he not signing on to this petition? He's an important part of this community. He's been there since the beginning. There's lots of people on here. Isaac Walker isn't. So that's going to become our next sort of through line for us. What in the world's happening? We have a pretty good idea. Let's go ahead and take a look. Wherever Isaac Walker is, why ever he didn't sign this petition, the church does move forward. Patterson is going to accept the job, and they're going to get to work on the construction of the Montour Presbyterian Church. And here we have one of the earliest descriptions of the church. And I'm going to put a picture of it up on the screen. But I want you to look really closely at the very last sentence. Let's go ahead and go through it. It was cruciform in shape and was built of hewn logs, meaning chopped down, hand-shaped. One arm of the cross was built on the north side, about the middle of the wall, and in that offset was the pulpit, which was reached by several steps from the floor. Sounds like a church to me. Just in front of the pulpit, on a platform raised a few steps from the floor and enclosed in front and on one side, stood the choir. The choir consisted of 2 persons, one to line out the psalms or hymns and the other to pitch the tune. I love that. That's funny. Opposite the pulpit, in the other arm of the cross or offset, was the door. All right, now here's the really important part. The church was not heated in winter. Several of the more strict congregants felt that this would be an innovation bordering on the heretical. Now, they built this church, what they're saying is, with no chimney and no fireplace. No chimney, no fireplace. And seemed to be an argument about it. The church was not heated in winter. Several of the more strict congregants felt that this would be an innovation bordering on the heretical. I know it sounds a little silly, but when you study Presbyterians enough, one of the things you learn is that, man, do they take it personally. They hold a grudge like you wouldn't believe, especially when it comes to organizing the church. Now, I know that doesn't seem like a huge deal to us, should there be a fireplace and chimney or not. But the reality was that was a titanic deal for them. They fought tooth and nail over it. And they fought so much that it even gave Joseph Patterson, the minister they're begging to come here, a little bit of pause on whether he wanted to do it or not. Is this the reason Isaac Walker does not sign that petition? Is this the reason Isaac Walker, and maybe others like him, do not want to be a part of this church? Something as silly as a chimney and fireplace. I think it might be. I think it might be. And I think that rift might be a lot older than we realize. Remember, this church in its idea is founded in 1778. The community decides on calling themselves the Montour Presbyterian Church in 1778. Maybe over that last 11 years, there's been a lot of little scraps and arguments like this. And maybe this fireplace, this heating element, is the straw that breaks the camel's back. Here, to me, is a dead giveaway that there is an internal strife within this organization. And it comes from May 25th, 1789. Here is a direct account, May 25th, 1789, once again as quoted in the book Old History of Old Montour. Mr. Patterson reports, he's the minister, right, that the difficulties which subsisted in the congregations of Upper Raccoon and Montours are now removed. That's what he says. In May, he says, the difficulties which have subsisted in the congregations are now removed. What does that mean? What difficulties is he talking about? Is he talking about internal squabbling over a fireplace? Or is he talking about that plus a whole bunch more problems that they have that divide them? Remember, Presbyterianism, Presbyterian churches on the frontier are the center of life. It's not just a religious place, but it's a political place. It's a place where civic ordinances are worked out. It's a place where neighbors handle disputes. It's a place where politics are discussed and news is revealed. There's a lot going on there. And as we know, all of those things can lead to some pretty heated arguments. But after the, quote, difficulties which subsisted are removed, Patterson accepts the job. Here he has it. Mr. Patterson, having accepted the call from Upper Raccoon in Montour's Run, is appointed to prepare a discourse on James 3:6 to be delivered at our August meeting as part of Trials in Order to Ordination. So there we go. They wanted a church since 1778. The American Revolution really interfered with that. After the terrible raids and deaths caused by the Revolution, I think it spurned on a desire to have a more concrete institution, especially a proper graveyard. There seemed to be some infighting here on the establishment of that church amongst the congregation, so much so that Isaac Walker, unlike his brother Gabriel and his neighbor James Ewing, didn't even sign up for it, didn't even sign his name to the petition. Here by May of '89, they officially have a minister on site. They have a church. George Washington is president as of about 4 weeks earlier, and they're off to the races. Here's the compelling part of this, and it's the next part of our episode, so stay put. There's going to be a second church founded just 5 years from this moment by a lot of the disaffected members of these original two congregations. And it's going to be the Union Presbyterian Church. And that's our next stop. And if you want to, get ahead of us here, if you want to try to take a guess as to who is the founding elder of that church, the person leading this resistance movement to the Montour Church, you'd be 100% right if you guessed it was Isaac Walker. He's going to break away and lead this new congregation himself.